Wrangham. I'm incredibly pleased that Richard Wrangham has accepted to deliver the keynote speech at the EISS. It's going to be on the evolutionary anthropology of war. And there are two reasons why I'm so happy to have Richard here. One is because I have to confess I have a big academic crush on Richard Wrangham. I'm very impressed by his scholarship. I'm currently working on the book, and while I was doing the research for the book, I covered Richard's work. And the more I was reading, the more I was exploring it, and the more I was impressed with it. And one of my concerns was, what on earth can I write that Richard hasn't already said more eloquently? And I still have this question in my head. The second reason is that the field of evolutionary anthropology and the field of security studies have many commonalities, and in particular, a focus on war. But despite this fact, they have remained in almost complete parallel silos. There are very few exceptions to this. One of them is Azar Gatz, even though he's not. So this would be one person. Another scholar is Dominic Johnson, and I recently discovered that he was a postdoctoral student of Richard, so not surprising. So I think really the dialogue between these two fields is extremely important, and so I think this is a perfect place to have this keynote speech. Richard Wrangham is the Ruth Moore Research Professor of Biological Anthropology, retired at Harvard University. He's a primatologist and an anthropologist. He was a student of the famous primatologist Jane Goodall. He has studied primate behavior, ecology, and nutrition for more or almost 50 years. And he's also the founder of the Kibale Chimpanzee Project, which was founded in 1987 to study the Kenyawara community of wild chimpanzees in Uganda. And he's best known for his work in a variety of areas. I'm not going to list them all and list the whole range of publications, just focus on a few to give you a sense for those of you who are not very familiar with his work. One is the role of cooking in human evolution. The controlled use of fire to cook food is probably the most far-reaching technological innovation in the history of the human lineage. And Richard has written probably the reference work on it, which is Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Humans. He's also published extensively on self-domestication. So he has very persuasively shown that the human species underwent a process of self-domestication, which essentially favored individuals less prone to reactive violence and more prone to cooperation. And so this has had a huge influence on our aggression profile as a species. And so it has shaped the type of violence in which we engage. And finally, and maybe even more closely related to clinical studies, he's most famous for his work on the evolution of human warfare. He's written extensively on it. He's by far the leading scholar in the field of evolutionary anthropology of war. He's published The Goodness Paradox, so the strange relationship between virtue and violence in human evolution, where he really synthesizes some of his work and the evolution of his work and on this topic. He has published also many articles. I'll just mention a few to give you an idea. So one was on the evolution of coalitionary killing, one on two types of human aggression, one which is reactive and one is proactive, and I suspect you may touch upon that. One really interesting on intergroup aggression in chimpanzees, comparing intergroup aggression in chimpanzees and in nomadic hunter-gatherers. And also, of course, a 2017 article titled The Evolutionary Anthropology of War. So in short, Richard Wrangham is the ideal scholar to deliver this keynote speech and to explore how we can think of synergies between the field of evolutionary anthropology and security studies. So what Richard will do is deliver a keynote speech, and then we'll open up the floor to discussion. So I hope we'll have a rich discussion after that. So please join me in thanking and welcoming Richard.
Well, thank you, Hugo. Thank you to Charles University, and thank you to all of you for staying after a long and I'm sure productive day. Maybe the rain has kept you here, but for whatever reason, thank you for being here. Of course, I hardly have to give my talk now, since Hugo has just pretty much given it for me. Let me just go over it again, as it were. So what I want to do is, first of all, give a little bit of an introduction to the nature of evolutionary anthropology. I think epistemologically, it's very different from fields you're used to. And then my entryway into thinking about the place of human nature, which seems to me to be an important concept for thinking about human behavior in general, such as war, is to use the paradox of humans being both very peaceful and very violent, and then use that as a way to get into an evolutionary history of lethal intergroup aggression, which ties us to other animals in a way that the word war does not, since war has so many other connotations beyond things that animals do. So in 1967, when I was just emerging to think about life, Konrad Lorenz published in English a book that he published a couple of years earlier in German called On Aggression. And in it, reflecting on the disasters of World War II, he said, well, humans are different from every other animal because humans kill members of their own species. And so the implication was that war is irrelevant, or evolutionary history is irrelevant to war. But only a few years later, there was the first case of a chimpanzee being killed by chimpanzees from a neighboring group, documented in the wild. And within whatever it is, 50 years almost of that, we had a published paper in which we could document 58 killings observed in 15 different communities of chimpanzees by chimpanzees. And in fact, those are only the ones that are observed, and there was a total of 152 that we suspected were going on, where sometimes the forensic evidence was not so great. So now the implication is that war is got something to do with animal behavior. And it was interesting to observe already within a few years of these observations that the killers were benefiting. They were getting access to land that they otherwise did not get. And the extra access to land gave them the resources needed to survive better and reproduce better. So we understand quite well, of course, the pattern of human evolution. We see it here with humans being the species. There's many different species that we recognize over the last roughly 2 million years. And before that, a series of apes, chimpanzee-sized Australopithecines that walked upright. The fact that we have chimpanzees killing each other and humans doing so obviously gives rise to the possibility that this represents something that's been going on for as long as these two branches of human and ape evolution have been going separately. We don't know if that's true, but it is provocative. Meanwhile, many other species turn out to be killing each other as well. So the Lorentzian hypothesis, which is a perfectly reasonable hypothesis, turns out to be just quite wrong. And it's very dramatic that in wolves, for instance, you can have a population in which 50% of the adults end up dying at the hands of other groups. So the notion that there is serious killing having a big biological evolutionary impact is very clear now from the point of view of looking at mostly some primates and a bunch of carnivores, dogs and cats, wolves and lions. So now we have the opportunity to think about an evolutionary anthropology of war. What was the prehistory of war? And once we start thinking about evolution, then what are the individual motivations that would be favored by over evolutionary time? How would they lead to the cooperative tendencies that are so vital once you're talking about war? Would a long evolutionary history lead to certain cognitive biases that we might tend to regard as mistakes, as errors, that actually turn out to be adaptive in the context of war? These are some of the sorts of questions that you start asking when you have an evolutionary theory applied. So in introducing an evolutionary theory or anthropology of war, let's just go through a little bit about the nature of evolutionary anthropology. And first of all, I want to emphasize that there are 4 kinds of questions that you can ask. they fall into two groups, the proximate and the ultimate. So the two proximate kinds of questions are the causation of behavior. What is it that produces the behavior at the time that it happens? What visual stimuli elicit the behavior? What nerves, what hormones, what muscles are involved? That's a mechanism question. Then there's the developmental question. How is it that the individual's behavior has been affected by its experiences when growing up? So there are all sorts of cultural and developmental issues there. And then there are the ultimate questions. There's the ultimate question about the evolution of a behavior. Has this behavior been seen in previous species and been generally modified over time or stayed stable over time? And finally, there's the other kind of an ultimate question, which is the functional one, the adaptive one. What is it about this behavior that led it to be favored over evolutionary time to become part of the species' behavioral repertoire? How did it increase fitness, which is the measure of genetic spread, that is the ultimate currency, equivalent, I think, to what you might think of as utility in your field. So take, for example, male-male bonding. Chimpanzees and humans have quite prominent male-male bonding in various ways. You can ask all sorts of questions about that of the four categories I've just been looking at. So in causation, you can think about the hormones or the physical contact that promotes male-male bonding. You can think about the developmental aspects of anything from play here to military training. You can think about the evolutionary aspects. So not very easy to get at in this particular case, but it's obviously suggestive that humans and chimpanzees may have similar mechanisms. And if it turns out that the mechanisms are really quite precisely similar, then it's a pretty good argument that they've had evolutionary continuity. And finally, there's the functional aspects, and we're beginning to see in various ways in which male bonds can promote male fitness in chimpanzees and to some extent humans. So those are the kinds of questions that we can ask. I want to draw attention to two big assumptions that maybe people haven't always appreciated that evolutionary anthropology holds. One is of human psychic unity. That is the assumption that all the populations in the world are, from the point of view of their genetic composition, psychologically uniform. It's obviously not true within populations. You get some people who are maybe psychopaths, who are, there's a genetic influence on psychopathy. But actually, the degree of psychopathy, 1 to 2% in males, say, is similar in different populations that have been looked at. But across populations, the founding assumption is that we're not going to be looking for genetic differences to explain behavioral differences between populations. And secondly, a more sort of tricky theoretical point, that natural selection does not act on group behavior. It acts on individual behavior. And in order to understand why you have a complicated group behavior like war going on in humans, you have to start thinking about the way in which individuals are benefiting from the behavior that ultimately becomes a group behavior. It is lazy and wrong intellectually to simply say, well, the group benefits as a whole. Ultimately, we have to go back to the individual level because that's the way that evolution works. I also want to mention some of the things that evolutionary anthropology does not do. So it does not, on a regular basis, say that something is either genetically caused or culturally caused. Basically, every behavior you can think of has got cultural influences and genetic influences. And these may come together in various different ways. The co-evolutionary framework is one that is quite often important. So co-evolution looks at a behavioral change, which is a kind of cultural, as it were, non-genetic, but then it leads to genetic changes. And so a couple of examples here are when people in Northern Europe started using milk as cheese or yogurt and ultimately drinking it, at that time, they were very intolerant of lactose as adults. But over time, evolution favored those individuals who were able to tolerate the lactose in milk much better. Similarly, once people started using fire, or I shouldn't say people, but pre-people started using fire, I think it was happening 2 million years ago, then one of the consequences was that they were able to rely on eating cooked food. They no longer needed to eat raw food. And it's led to the position now, because we've adapted to eating our food cooked, that unlike every other species on Earth, we actually require our food to be processed in a cooking or cooking-like way. We cannot survive in the wild on raw food, so we're not good as chimpanzees. Secondly, evolutionary anthropology does not make any assumptions about the direction of evolution. So I mention this particularly because 100 years ago or something like that, there was the idea that maybe there was a kind of a fairly fixed way in which societies tend to develop. Well, we don't think that nowadays. Societies, just like body size or the degree of aggressiveness, can go more complex, less complex, more intense, less intense, and so on, just depending on the selective pressures at the time. Thirdly, we do not assume that every trait is adaptive. It might be, that is certainly the initial expectation that traits are going to be adaptive, but there are various ways in which they might not be adaptive. One of them is if the evolutionary conditions under which the trait evolved have changed. So it may now be non-adaptive for us to respond to our body's desire for salt and fat and sugar, because we're now in an environment in which we can get so much of it that we can get too much, and it becomes maladaptive. Another example is the incidental effects. When people select for domesticated animals, all sorts of results emerge that are not to do with the behavior. So isn't it striking that many different domesticated animals have got floppy ears and have got white patches of fur on them? Nobody selected to say, let's have all the cows and the horses and the goats and the dogs with white patches of fur on their forehead. It's just something that happens to emerge when you select against reactive aggression. Well, that sort of example of incidental effects, selecting on one thing and then producing another effect, is something you always have to be alert to. And finally, we cannot be accused anymore of a eugenicist approach to life, where the conclusions of evolutionary anthropology would be directed towards stopping some people breeding, whether they be the poor in your own country or the criminal or people in another country altogether. So with that very rapid survey of evolutionary anthropology, let me turn to my entry point into thinking about the nature of human nature. So this is the peace-violence paradox, which you see represented by, on the left side, the capacity for humans to come together with strangers in large crowds, jostling each other, and to put up with each other very well. And that's just representative of the fact that humans are an astonishingly tolerant and peaceful species. And I'll give you data about this later. And on the other hand, the attack on the Twin Towers is meant to represent the fact that humans can behave with complete lack of what we think of as morality when it comes to intergroup aggression. The rate of violence, and again, I'll give you some data on this later, in humans is astonishingly high compared to the majority of animals. It's not quite as bad as wolves, but nevertheless, we're right up there among the more violent species. So how do we address this? I am impressed by the fact that for a long time, people have found it difficult to understand in a coherent way how it is that we have these two tendencies for extreme tolerance and extreme violence. And I think the problem has been that we have tended to think intuitively that the nature of human nature should fall on a single scale of aggressiveness. So I got this rather peculiar cartoon to represent us from more of a lamb to more of a lion. And the question is, where do we lie along this? So what is it about humans that comes in terms of our evolutionary traits? One argument has been that we are naturally peaceful and we are corrupted by society. And Rousseau has become the iconic representative of that view. The alternative has been Hobbes's view, also the icon, but for the opposite, the notion that we are born aggressive and we are civilized by society or the Leviathan into behaving relatively tolerantly. But I want to point out that, as of course has been known for a long time, we can't be at both ends of this single scale of aggression. You can't be Hobbesian and Rousseauian and make any sense. So the solution here is that we should be thinking not of a single scale, but of two scales of aggression. And on the left, you see a whole series of words that characterize one form of the aggression. I'm going to be calling it proactive. If you go into real detail about the aggressions, you'll find minor differences among instrumental and premeditated and predatory and so on. But basically, it's a sufficiently uniform cluster to represent one style. And on the other hand, there is a behavior that I'll call reactive aggression. And again, a whole series of words for it. Where, again, slightly different concepts, but useful to package together. So proactive aggression. Here is a behavior that has been premeditated, is deliberate, and it is planned and maybe even conducted with not necessarily much emotional intensity at all. It's characterized by having a specific goal. It might be to go and kill someone or kill a bunch of people, or it might be to achieve a goal that necessitates killing on the way as an incidental part of it. This tends to be coalitionary, several individuals making their plans together, and it can involve hunting other species, but also it can involve hunting your own species. Reactive aggression is aggression that gets rid of a threat that suddenly appears in your life. If you're a man and you come home and you find your wife in bed with another man, that is a sudden threat, and you respond with generally not much thought. You just respond violently. The goal is to get rid of that threat very, very quickly. It does involve a lot of emotion at the time, and reactive aggression is typically individual. This distinction has actually been made a long time in different fields. You can go back to the 18th century and find people making a difference between murder 1 and murder 2. You get a lower penalty, of course, for reactive murders as opposed to proactive murders. The distinction has been followed through in biology and psychology and genetics and neurobiology, as I will show you, but only recently applied to evolutionary anthropology. But it seems to be useful because it is a distinction that we see in other animals as well. Here is a bunch of chimpanzees who are walking off towards the border area with the neighboring territory where a separate group of chimpanzees lives with whom they never interact on a positive way. And what they might be doing is going up to a ridge and then looking out and waiting, listening for a call. And if they hear the call, slowly approaching where the call was heard and trying to hide, trying to be silent until they get so close that they can afford to charge, which would be 5 or 6 yards away, and attack some individual. And that's very different from reactive aggression, where classically a male might be insulted, as it were, by having another male refuse to give the signals of subordinacy that acknowledge the dominance of the first male. In that case, the first male will go into a quick charge, and that charge may go on for 20 seconds or something and involve hitting and even biting in the intense versions. So you've got a clear distinction there. The distinction is also found in rats and mice. And in those species, there's been enough work to be able to see that they are encoded neurobiologically in different tracts. So in both cases, you have the central aggression circuit from the amygdala to the hypothalamus to the periaqueductal gray involved, but the particular neural tracts, the siting of them in the circuit varies, indicating very clearly that you can have evolution of the two forms of aggression going in separate directions. I want to make the point that proactive aggression, even in animals, turns out to be remarkably judicious. And the judicious decision is to conduct proactive aggression only when you have a relatively large imbalance of power. The picture here is of a stranger who was killed by my chimpanzees. So I work with a particular community, has about 10 to 12 adult male chimpanzees at any one time. And they found this stranger on the edge of their range, and they attacked and killed him. So he was fighting for his life. He's something like 3 or 4 times as strong as a human. And it is remarkable that neither in this case nor in any other that have been recorded have any of the attacking chimpanzees been hurt. Then none of them have received any kind of serious wounds in the course of these fights. And that's because they are so judicious as to, on average, have 8 males per victim that they attack. And so you can imagine that several of them can immobilize the victim, just hold them down, grab one hand, hold a leg, and the others can do the damage. And the damage is very deliberate. Take an arm and twist it until the muscles break, bite off the testicles, tear into the thorax. So this is very deliberate stuff. The pattern of proactive killing in humans, we could take it at various different levels, from something like this, where you have somebody who is quite clearly just a prisoner and is just going to be killed, and there's no chance that the killers are themselves going to be hurt in conducting this kill, all the way through to wars and battles, where the question I know is an interesting one in IR theory as to how often is it the case that the initiator of a war or a battle tends to win. And I understand there's some variation in that, but the general pattern seems to be that the initiators tend to win, although there are fascinating exceptions too. Of course, sometimes in humans, what you find is that the killers get killed in turn, but the killing in turn will be by another proactive attack on the killers rather than an immediate reactive one by those who are being killed, because of the care with which the killers initially organized to kill in a way that makes it safe for them to do so. Proactive aggression between groups is strikingly high in humans and chimpanzees compared to any other primates. What I've done here is to pull some of the standard sources from the literature showing the percentage of population killed per year in intergroup aggression among people of different subsistence style, foragers or hunters and gatherers, small-scale farmers, pastoralists, some industrial societies, and then different communities of chimpanzees. So I draw your attention to the fact that in the few decades in which these populations have been sampled, there is a lot of variation between some who have a high and some who have a low or zero rate of killing from intergroup aggression. But overall, this is all strikingly high compared to the average primate, or actually every other primate, in which the figure would be 0. But here we have significant rates. And just to remind you how significant they are, the industrial societies include 4 countries that went through World War I and World War II. So this is 90 years of data. And despite the appalling losses there, the average loss over this time is less than what you're seeing in small-scale societies and chimpanzees. Reactive aggression, on the other hand, is a very different pattern when we compare humans and chimpanzees. So on the left here, you see various samples of chimpanzees, male and female, the frequency of physical aggression per 1,000 hours. I can't guarantee for you that every case was reactive, but the great majority would have been, although we still need sort of serious samples where people are deciding at the time that they're watching whether it's proactive or reactive. But by comparison, the human data there on the right-hand side, vanishingly small, are from a community of Australian Aborigines who were judged to have a particularly high rate of fighting within their community because they were a disturbed group that had a lot of alcohol, a lot of time on their hand, and were basically in very unhappy circumstances. And it's not very easy finding data on the rates of just physical fighting because humans don't do it that much. So that is a striking example. And here's another striking example where the anthropologist Kim Hill says that in 43 years of field work working with the Aceh hunter-gatherers in Paraguay, he has never seen a scuffle. People are remarkably muted in terms of their spontaneous tendency to fight with each other compared to the chimpanzees. Now, look at the chimpanzees, it's per 1,000 hours. It's not happening every day, but it still is a lot higher than what we are used to. So what I want to argue from this section of the talk is that it's long overdue, actually, that we should be thinking about two scales for our evolved aggressive tendencies. And in comparison to chimpanzees and other primates, we can place humans on the very high end of the proactive aggression scale. We have a high propensity to judge when it pays us to conduct aggression from a perspective that benefits ourselves and to do it. And on the other hand, we have a very low propensity for reactive aggression compared to chimpanzees and bonobos, by the way, for those of you who know them, and other species. So that's the sort of summary of that middle part of the talk. Let me go on to just be thinking about an evolutionary history of lethal intergroup aggression, given this distinction between the proactive and reactive and how that can help us distinguish our two types of behavior of violence and cooperation. There's been a long tradition of thinking of hunters and gatherers, nomadic hunters and gatherers, the style of people who have been our ancestors for at least 1 million years, probably 2 million years. There's been a long tradition of thinking of them as the harmless people. And in many ways they are nowadays, and that is because they live in circumstances in which it would be foolish to go around attacking other people. To try and find out more about this, archaeologists come up with quite often unanticipated finds where there is evidence of prehistoric violence, but it's generally rather difficult to tell whether or not that violence has been the result of something happening within a group or between groups, and exactly what the meaning of the group would be. But I think the really convincing evidence about the nature of war in the past comes from looking at hunter-gatherer warfare when we restrict our analysis to cases where hunters and gatherers have been observed or documented living next to other hunters and gatherers who speak a different language, who are a different group in the sense of having a different culture. And then what we see is something very consistent. We see that war is universal. Here's just a taste of it. On the left-hand side, 6 different culture areas around the world. And I've drawn attention to 2 features in particular. One is shoot on sight. You know, the tragedy, there are awful stories of people getting lost and struggling, such as in the Arctic, on an ice floe to find land, and before they can even get off the ice floe and say hello to people, they're shot and killed. Because the spontaneous reaction of hunter-gatherer groups has very often been, you cannot trust a stranger. Let's kill them before and ask no questions. The second column there refers to the fact of the main style of war. And this is by ambush and raids. And this is just a very consistent feature of hunters and gatherers as it is of small-scale society in general, which is that you get a planned raid where individuals approach a neighboring enemy camp, and they may plonk a few arrows and kill someone, and then run away again. It is characteristic that they are avoiding battles. They do not want to get into anything like or approaching a line battle. They want to make an attack and then get out of that. So in that sense, warfare was below the military horizon. It was not involving a military. There was no sense in which you have a leader and others under him. When they would go on these raids, they certainly knew what they were doing. They had maybe been up all night cooperating in the idea, then setting off before dawn, and very often making these attacks in the early hours. Maybe it would take 1 or 2 days to get to the enemy before they would actually make the attack. Not everybody had to go, but you certainly lost a certain amount of sort of social prestige if you decided not to go. Once there, then if the enemy were defending at all effectively, then that would be particularly quick result in terms of the attackers leaving. So once the attackers detected that there was a good chance of any of them being hurt, they would run away. Again, part of the judicious aspect of proactive aggression. And I mentioned particularly the lack of self-sacrifice. Some of you may have come across the evolutionary theorists' concept of parochial altruism, the notion that humans have been selected to be altruistic with each other in the face of enemies. But actually, when you look at the hunter-gatherer data, there's vanishing little, I would say no evidence that stands up to scrutiny. And I think that to the extent that parochial altruism exists, the tendencies for self-sacrifice, the willingness to die on behalf of your group, we should not think of that as an evolutionary characteristic. We should think of it as something that has been culturally imbued. So using this approach that nomadic hunters and gatherers are characterized, as chimpanzees are, by a tendency for lethal intergroup aggression, how old are war and peace? And here what we see is a graph in which I've plotted the cranial capacity, brain size, against time. And we see Homo sapiens on the extreme right, and then some earlier species of Homo. And everyone agrees that Homo has been dominated by being nomadic hunters and gatherers, very probably starting with Homo erectus. And so that suggests that since that time, as hunters and gatherers, following the strong association of hunting and gathering with warfare, that we've had that form of high proactive aggression going back for at least 1 million and probably 2 million years, depending on whether you think the archaeology can really support the notion of hunting and gathering in the very early years. So that's war in the sense that hunters and gatherers show. What about reactive aggression? When did that go low? In 2003, Helen Leach, an archaeologist in New Zealand, drew attention to the fact that humans have got a series of characteristics. And here what I mean by humans is Homo sapiens and not earlier species. So I'm now talking about what happened about 300,000 years ago. We emerged with a series of characteristics that intensified over time: short face, small teeth, feminization of the skull and skeleton, a lighter body, and ultimately a surprising reduction in brain size. And these are characteristics by which archaeologists recognize the occurrence of domestication in wild animals. So the time when you can recognize that a wolf has become a dog or an auroch has become a cow is the time when you see these characteristics in them, in the bones that you're digging up in the ground. And those are domesticated species that, from a biological point of view, can be said to be species that have a low degree, low intensity, a low propensity for reactive aggression. The expectation from this idea, which is that Homo sapiens are different from other species of Homo by having been domesticated, in other words, having a lower propensity for reactive aggression, is that we should see some kind of commonality with domesticated animals, because that's what we see among domesticated animals. I mentioned the white patches. So many different domesticated animals have got white patches as a result of being selected against reactive aggression. They have these anatomical features as a result of being selected against reactive aggression. Do we share genes with domesticated animals? The evidence is certainly not complete, but the evidence that has come in so far is looking very interesting. And here is one case of a particularly influential gene, BAZ1B, which is known to be associated with a very tolerant kind of temperament. It's found in domesticated animals in a way that it is not found in their wild ancestors, and it is found in Homo sapiens in a way that it is not found in Neanderthals and Denisovans, which are the only species that we have to be able to compare with, because they're the only ones that provide genetic data at the moment. They're not our ancestors, but they would be samples of species of Homo that have not been domesticated. So then that raises the fascinating question: if you can buy the argument that our extraordinary tolerance is equivalent to what's happened in domesticated animals, our remarkable reduction in reactive aggression, why did this happen? And I want to suggest that the only plausible mechanism is that it has been executed out of us. Nowadays, it is the case that execution has been found to be a phenomena of societies worldwide, including hunters and gatherers on every continent. Not literally every hunter-gatherer group has been found to have execution, but I put that down to just short sample size in some cases. We certainly know that execution has been used to select against the most violent men. It's a routine in societies that men who violate societal morality end up being executed. We tend to forget this nowadays, perhaps, in a world in which imprisonment is so prevalent that we forget the rougher part of our past. But execution has been incredibly important. And it's certainly males more than females who tend to get executed, and it can happen at very high rates. And here's the most extreme example I know of from New Guinea, where they were able to show in a small-scale society there that 24% of men had been executed by members of their own group, of course. The significant difference between humans and other species is that only humans are capable of execution. This is a form of proactive aggression that needs a lot of conversation to be able to carry it out. And even now, it's not that easy a thing to organize. Chimpanzees do kill other members of their own group, but in no case do you see any evidence that it is proactive. And that makes sense, because how do you decide? How would a chimpanzee be able to communicate to another one the idea that we should execute some other member of their own group? It is not very easy to imagine how it would be done. Even among humans, it's not very easy to see how it is done because of the great difficulty that once you start suggesting that somebody should be executed, then you're putting yourself in the danger that that victim will try and turn the tables and say, you're the troublemaker, it's going to be you that should be executed. I think that what this means is that the complexity of deciding to be able to work out this dynamic depends on a very sophisticated form of language. So the theory that I want to propose to you is that conspiratorial language emerged in the ancestors of Homo sapiens to the point where they were able to conduct this way of handling the extremely violent men in their society who were trying to dominate the members of their own group. And just as you can see occasionally happening nowadays in small-scale society, and you can probably think of parallel examples even among ourselves, just as a group of men will come together to try and suppress a bully, then this, I suggest, has had evolutionary effects. So language allows the ability to execute, and then that has led to a self-domesticated species. And once you have a self-domesticated species, then new things come along, new abilities to cooperate, We know from animals that species that have relatively tolerant relationships with each other are much better at cooperating. It obviously makes sense. Other things happen too. Once you have execution, then of course you have extraordinary ability for the leaders of a group to be able to coerce and threaten other members of their group, so that the degree to which it is possible to establish social conformity in pursuit of an idea that high-ranking members of the group wish to see enacted enormously increases. Basically, a high-ranking chimpanzee or a high-ranking lion cannot tell others what to do. But in humans, you can, because of the threat of execution. So I think that execution, self-domestication, tolerance, coercion, the current evidence is that it evolved with our species at about 300,000 years ago, long after the capacity for war, but doubtless greatly increasing the capacity for war. I want to draw attention to the fact that I've just dealt with one kind of paradox. Hugo has got interested in the second sort of feature of the peace aspect of the paradox, which is the human ability to negotiate peace between groups. And there is some intriguing archaeological evidence that he has cited, which I think I agree with, is a good indication of the possibility that when you had objects moving across the landscape, not just 25 or 50 kilometers from their source, but 100 or 500 kilometers from their source, that suggests that there was sufficiently friendly trading relationships that there was peace emerging. And so we can start thinking about the capacity for humans to go to a new kind of peace that is not found in other animals at that point. So in thinking about an evolutionary history of war, does war have a deep evolutionary history? I absolutely think it does, but not battles. So thinking about battles is a pretty recent thing. The notion that lethal battles have emerged is a different kind of question altogether. The current evidence from animals and some somewhat tentative evidence from hunter-gatherers is that intergroup killing is certainly adaptive. It's performed very judiciously, and it seems to lead to benefits for the group. But when we think about the group, it particularly leads to benefits for some of the males who are conducting the aggression. So this suggests that humans are well adapted evolutionarily for intergroup violence. There's hundreds of thousands of years that they've been able to polish this, and that various psychological biases that we bring to the pattern of intergroup aggression, like the overconfidence bias that makes us more confident as we approach an interaction that we are going to win it and that they have not got the capacity to defend themselves well, maybe in some ways maladaptive from the point of view of just the immediate outcome, because you've got two sides, both of whom think they're going to win. But from an evolutionary point of view, it may well be adaptive in terms of promoting success for the winners. And then how is killing related to cooperation? Well, I've given some examples. I think the prospects for evolutionary theory to interact with IR theory seem to me to be quite promising. Hugo mentioned Dominic Johnson. I'll just draw attention to an article that he and Brad Thayer wrote in 2016, in which they drew attention to the fact that there does not seem to be a very strong theory of human nature in IR theory, and they wanted to bring in the notion of evolved dispositions as being an important component of understanding how we should think about war even today, despite the enormous complexities of war compared to the simple kinds of intergroup interaction that I have been talking about. So I'm hoping that Hugo's effort in trying to reconcile or to introduce evolutionary anthropology and IR theory to each other take hold and flourish. Thank you very much for listening. I've got to want to acknowledge a whole bunch of collaborators, and happy to take questions if there's any time at all.
Thank you so much, Richard. It was truly fascinating. Are there questions? Okay, John.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wrangham. It's absolutely fascinating. So your explanation relies on a Darwinian understanding of evolution, which is of course the dominant sort of understanding. But recently, and I followed this, there's been sort of a bit of a, I'm going to say, Lamarckian return. People have found more and more a sort of cellular memory can be found from one to the next generation. It's striking, I found, for instance, that people who have experienced extreme atrocities, that's what we see in Ukraine or Palestine at the moment, that this can affect directly the next generation in terms of how they relate, or like life expectancies and all these kinds of things. So I think if that Lamarckian return is really true, then we could have a situation where both soul and ghosts are right, because you could have a situation where some people are literally born evil because of what the previous generation experienced, and others are solely sort of, because of the experiences turning into very violent people. This is obviously just like thinking I'm very new, but my question is, what do you think about this? And along with that, what do you think would be the biggest disruptive new finding in evolutionary anthropology that could challenge some of your assumptions? Questions?
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Really fascinating talk. There was one question that remained for me about, and it's about the role of opinions. I feel maybe somewhat of a puzzle here, which is that on the one hand, evolution or less like people to initiate violence or participate in violence. But on the other hand, the slide we have on the global power imbalance, we wonder if this should be of females not having enough power. If they weren't in these sort of powerful, they would still take the same kind of decisions that males are. So I wonder what about like seemingly different suggestions.
Okay, so let's take one more question, Tim.
Thank you for a maybe lecture. I have two very quick questions. One relates to the following. I always said Homo sapiens is a Homo narans, who can then be a Homo larans, right? Homo sapiens tells stories and thereby can wage war. Essentially, you very convincingly argue that it not only allowed the Homo sapiens to wage war, but also to impose peace within groups. I was wondering whether you could expand your expose as to how it relates to the development of language abilities and what we know of that. So that's my first question. The second question relates to the fact that in war studies, we oftentimes relate causes of war to the territoriality of Homo sapiens. What I always find striking is that Homo sapiens only decided to settle very late in the game. I mean, this took, of course, thousands of years, but it's from 12,000 years and onwards ago that this happened. How, in the context of your language and proposal piece within a group, how can you explain that Homo sapiens settled so late?
Okay, now I have to remember what the questions are. All right. So, John, you're asking if it's really fair to think of the way that evolution works as being Darwinian because of evidence of some Lamarckian effects. And the short story, I would say, is that the impact of the kind of effects you're talking about, which I think refers to epigenetics, is going to be very small across the populations. The extent to which individuals will develop a new kind of behavior that is passed on in their genes, it certainly can happen experimentally, but that itself becomes the target, as it were, of Darwinian selection. So you're not going to have a runaway Lamarckian process that is independent of Darwin. I feel confident we can stick to Darwin. You had a second part of your question.
Most disruptive. thing we could see in the discipline?
Oh, yes. Well, that would be fascinating. I'm going to have to think about that. But something I did want to pick up on what you said was, you said that maybe Hobbes and Rousseau are both right. Well, of course, I think they are both right, but they're also both wrong. You know, they were both right in terms of saying that there are these propensities that humans have to be either violent or not. It's just that they were wrong in saying that the other one is wrong. Females. I feel really that it's impossible to give a talk like this without apologizing for not talking more about female interests. And female interests are clearly very important, but female participation is enormously less than male in these activities. I mean, we see it in the chimpanzees, for instance, and clearly we see it in humans in terms of the actual process of the war. So if we wanted to go take a deeper dive into thinking about the transition from individual behavior into group action, then the influence of women, either individually talking to men or in coalitions as conspiracies, as it were, is clearly important. But I think at the same time, you know, this is a disgustingly male world. It is, I say disgustingly because males have brought tremendous violence and tremendous unhappiness on our species, I think from, you know, basically the beginning of our species. And I don't think we can get away from that just by thinking about our desire nowadays to balance our interest in males and females. Is that a totally inadequate answer to?
I think I wanted to hear what you might have to say about women entering these sort of positions in military in their decision making, where they might be now able to make decisions about inflicting violence.
Yeah.
And if that would then, you would predict then that there would be lesser cases of violence because women, according to this logic, are not as violent, or would that be not very different because the question of power is actually separate from.
Yeah, I think it's still a remarkably open question. You know, if you can just imagine getting rid of males altogether, and part of me thinks that it would be great to make the Y chromosome extinct, then what would happen to foreign relations? Would they just carry on as they are? My own suspicion is not that IR theory is basically a theory about male behavior, but we don't have, you know, resounding evidence to talk about that. I can say that if you look at and this is a bit of a stretch, I guess, but if you look at male and female chimpanzees occasionally go on border patrols, but it's not very much. But within the group, you find that competition among individual males is far more intense than competition among individual females. It involves, you know, literally more killing on the occasional kills, but it involves much more within group aggression. And you get all sorts of fascinating parallels to what you see in human groups. So when you have a hegemon, then there tends to be peace. And then as the hegemon gets weaker, then a beta male comes up and tries to attack the alpha male, and that has knock-on effects throughout the whole social network. You get alliances that can change this and form more of a balance of power, and so on. And you read about individual male chimpanzees, and you're just constantly thinking about IR theory. But then you look at individual female chimpanzees, where again, dominance matters. So high-ranking females do better than low-ranking females, but they do not compete for dominance in the same way. They compete for dominance much more by being able to live for a long time. And basically what happens is that when a female enters the dominance hierarchy at adolescence, it establishes a pretty low ranking position, and then she just tends to increase it over time. So there's astonishing difference between males and females there. I wish we could have something sort of equivalent to be able to study in humans, but that's part of why my tendency is to think that we would indeed be a safer world without men. Language, you were asking about. I'm definitely support the notion that once you have self-domestication and increased tolerance among individuals, then communication becomes easier. There's evidence from animals about this, and that would be a positive feedback loop involving language. So it'd be easier to be able to pay attention to each other, to look each other in the eye, and pay attention to each other's linguistic communications, and then so you get a positive feedback loop between the quality of the communication and the ability to listen to each other. A sticking point in thinking about the evolution of language is my proposal that you needed to have a conspiratorial quality of language in order to be able to get this thing going. And in order to be able to make that suggestion, I have to say, I have no idea where it came from. But what I do think is that language would have been increasing in quality for a long time, maybe 2 million years, maybe since Homo erectus, maybe less than that. And just as it increased in quality in other species of Homo, so it just happened to increase in quality to the point where these conspiratorial abilities emerge. So it's magic out of the hat, you know. On the other hand, no one else has really got very ideas about language that you can really pin down to any kind of empirical test at the moment. So it's frustrating, but that's where it is. There's another
Territoriality.
Yeah, the territoriality. Okay, so we call nomadic hunters and gatherers nomadic because what they do, a band, say, of 20 or 30 people, they make a camp for a few weeks, and then they nomadize. They move off to a new place within their territory. So nomadic hunters and gatherers do have territories. It's just that they move around within them. And so they are still defending territories at that time. And if they find evidence from footprints that they don't recognize, or objects that shouldn't be where they are found somewhere they shouldn't be, then that would be a cause for mounting a raid. So I don't want to give the impression that nomadism is at variance with territoriality. But what the territoriality you're referring to is the establishment of permanent houses where people have villages and they're living there for years on end. And that is indeed important. And a lot of people indeed think that once you have an accumulation of resources in such a stable environment, then that will itself be another influence promoting a more elaborate kind of war.
Okay, so we started the lecture a bit later, so we're going to end it a bit later. All right, so yes, Sana.
Thank you for an engaging talk. So I have two quick questions. The first one is, I want to ask a little bit about the coexistence of two types of violence. So for example, if we think about Liane Fuji's work about killing in the Wrangham genocide, right? Like you have both instances of premeditated violence and an instance of what you call reactive violence. So can they also coexist rather than on different, like how do we think about that? And then the second question is bringing up another social science concept, which is deterrence and threats and the role of that. How would that fit within this framework, right? Like not the actual execution of violence, but the threats and whether that's like evolutionary origin.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, and it's exciting for some people that usually think that relation cycle. I have a question that I between your perspective and little science. It has to do with variation over time that's longer than we work, but much shorter than you do.
And I was thinking about when you talk about a specific German sociologist, maybe Norbert Elias, and I don't know if you know him, but he wrote a famous book in the 30s called The Process of Civilization, which is basically the transformation of we call it psychogenesis that follows social genesis, a new way of thinking that follows from constitution of centralized societies from the end of the Middle Ages towards centralized states in Europe. And the easiest way to understand this argument is that we give away a lot of violent behavior in our everyday lives on the inside of states in that period. Usually, because we also reconstitute our way of thinking. Best is perhaps Alexander Dumas' novel about the three musketeers, because the central theme in that story that is that it's a problem for the central authorities that so many young men are killing each other due to a concept of honor. So they keep killing each other, and all these local young men die off, and it's a problem. So they have to stop them from following these concepts of honor and stop it. And Elias' story is basically sort of a macro sociology, but only 500 years. And what I'm struck by is that there's actually, compared to your very long time span, a very strong variation of norms and standards in a relatively short time span in that way, that is on the inside of these groups, organization states, have resulted in a very big change. This add on to that, even in our lifespan, it's been clear that when my parents grew up, it's normal for parents to beat their children. And that's generally found on today very much. So in a even shorter time span, we've seen a relatively sharp increase in the acceptance of violence, relationships on the private scale. And that's a very, very big change in a relatively short time. So I just wanted to reflect on that, how it fits into the way you're thinking about it.
Okay, one more, Sander.
Well, thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. I guess I can react a little bit to your slide. You had various calculation theories put up there. You mentioned there's realism, but there's also really that goes realism. There's actually a lot of higher theory about cooperation, and that literature emphasizes the role of institutions. And indeed, as much as we may be similar to campaigns, our way of our use of violence, there are different perspectives in the sense that we do have institutions that regulate violent action, cooperation. So I guess my question, the phrasing of the previous question, what is actually the role of evolutionary biology or anthropology to account for the development of institutions? I don't want to say Stephen Pinker's name, but I couldn't help but think of his call of him while listening to your presentation. Is he wrong, or are you just taking a very different angle? Like, how should I reconcile the sorts of observations on those issues in mind?
Okay, maybe you can answer, and we'll take one more round of questions.
Right, I might miss it, but so in both in Rousseau and Hobbes, then there's a social contract theory that follows the initial state of nature. So my question would be how you can then, apart from what you just presented, to then have an idea of what a state might look like. And also according to these, how can you, for example, say that terrorist groups from the state take into account what you just presented? That's something you work on?
Can you rephrase the question? I can't hear it very well.
Oh, sorry. So my question is both Rousseau and Hobbes, they have then a social contract theory,
Yes.
like the kind of state that emerges from this initial point. And I was wondering if you also did something similar for what you just presented. Oh, and if, for example, based on your distinction, how can you then separate, for example, state actors to non-state actors? Like, what's the difference between a terrorist group and the state, according to what you just presented?
Basically, if your argument applies only to pre-state actors.
Okay. Right. Okay, so there was the relationship between proactive and reactive aggression in the context of genocide.
Yeah, for example, the genocide in Rwanda.
The Rwandan genocide. So I'm not sure I see any significant role for reactive aggression in that. You know, the thing that I was very impressed with was radiomylcholine, where for weeks, maybe months before the genocide, the idea was being promulgated, as I understand it, that the Tutsi, are cockroaches, and we are many more than them, and we can get rid of them. And coming with my understanding of the way that proactive aggression is regulated, where there is, in a sense, a release of our tendencies for proactive aggression, if we are convinced that we can get away with it, then the notion that the Hutu were saying, look, we can get away with it, was feeding right into something very deep in us. And that to me was all very, very proactive. And, you know, obviously one case like that is not enough, but it does seem to me to mean that we should be very alert to any kind of messages in a war context that talk about the fact that our side is able to so dominate the other side that we could kill them without them being able to effectively respond. Institutions. So I totally think that this kind of approach can accommodate and needs to accommodate and work with an institutional framework. I'll be so bold as to say that I think we can see the origins of institutions in this framework. And what I'm thinking of there is that the idea that I've been presenting, which began with Christopher Bowen, is that in Origins of Homo sapiens, the critical early phenomenon was that there was a way for a tyrant in the group being quite a small group, maybe half a dozen males, the despot, the tyrant, was able to be overcome. And they were able to be overcome by the conspiracy of several other adult males agreeing to get rid of him. Once they had done that, then of course it would be very dangerous for any of them to try and become the replacement tyrant, because they would themselves be subject to that same winnowing process. And at that point, you have a new kind of leadership system, which does not happen in any other species. And the new kind of leadership system is that the dominant hierarchy of males is led by not an individual, but by a group. Well, I want to suggest that that group is the founding institution. And what it does is to create, ultimately, I think, the law, because what the law does is to arbitrate about violence. And if somebody is violent within the group, then they are subject ultimately to the decision-making process that is enacted through this body of men, none of whom dares to be the leader on their own, who rely on each other's collaboration to be able to maintain a monopoly of on the expression of violence within the group. So I think that we see in the establishment of these coalitions a new system of domination by males in which it's among a group. Later, of course, you do get leaders, but they're different from the alpha males of a primate because they're always subject to their own allies. And in that group, I was thinking that that is the origin of the law and of all the other ways in which alliances of males, who I think are usefully called alpha alliances, dominate society, whether it's in politics or religion or law. So I can't remember the details of your questions, but you know the essence of it is that I think we're seeing here the institutions that ultimately lead to decision-making in the group. Now, I find it, fascinating as an evolutionary biologist to read about social contract theory with the implication sometimes that although people don't actually form these contracts, that somehow contracts have emerged between the rich and the poor, men and the women, less, I guess, there, the advantage and the disadvantage in a way that is mutually beneficial. And I have to confess, I see the world as much more driven by dominance relationships, in which the notion of a social contract, it seems to work well for a ship, where you've got a captain who invites people to join him in the on the ship and is not forcing them to come, and you have some kind of discipline. But not when you're talking about hunters and gatherers, not when you're talking about the societies that I know best, where even though we would love to impose a model of equal human rights on all these people, we actually do not see that. We see patriarchy in all hunter-gatherer societies. And where does that patriarchy come from? It comes from the group of men who are making the decisions about the law. There's some kind of problem in the group. It's a rape or a murder at the most extreme. What happens? It ultimately goes back to the elders. Who are the elders? They're the group of old men, old meaning maybe just in their 40s, who make a decision about what is going on in the rest of the group. And that is not out of a social contract. That is because they do things that benefit themselves, and others are forced to put up with it. So, go back to the question about females earlier. You will find societies that have such a difference in female and male power in hunters and gatherers that females may inadvertently walk on a path that has been designated by the males as being a male-only path, and the females will be punished to the point in some extreme cases of being executed. Nothing remotely happens like that in the other direction. There may be some female secret societies, but they do not have the power of execution. And with the power of execution vested in a group of men at the top of the society, I think you have a power to run the society in a way that has ultimately given rise to a much softer, gentler kind of institutional framework. Nevertheless, that's the continuing domination of groups of males at the top of society.
Time maybe for one or two last questions. Yes.
So many of integrations and planning to presenting, I find them quite depressing about human nature and what it means for future and what we're trying to study too. And I wanted this maybe a bit more of a personal question. How you deal with that? You've been working on this for 40 years or more, and you're looking at violence and you're witnessing also private violence, looking at it, showed some pictures. Does it affect you, and can you remain optimistic when you make these arguments that all these going bad because it's patriarchy that is dominated by people who dominate each other?
I'll take the advantage of the position to ask you a question, but it's basically a follow-up question on what you just said before, because basically, so tomorrow we have a roundtable on gender discrimination and exclusion in academia. You have now made your views on the role of men in society quite clear. And you gave, by the way, a great lecture in Stanford University. I don't remember when exactly, but it's available online on the deep origins, deep roots of societal patriarchy. So could you maybe lay out for us your views on the link between the process of self-domestication that you discussed before and the origins of societal patriarchy?
Okay. Well, taking your question first, which I appreciate, I mean, obviously it's...
Sorry, you have one more?
Oh, sorry.
Very much for your talk. I am just curious about the role of nature and society, so I have to step out, but I think at the end. I'm aware that some mammals do not include hierarchies around dominance. And I'm just wondering about in terms of whether or not you also see this variation. I'm aware that this is the case with some North American-based indigenous groups. The use of oral history with evidence, the EISS. I'm just wondering if you could also might be shaped by knowing might affect dominance or language.
Should we go? Okay, so I appreciate the question about optimism and so on. I think it is fairly hard to be optimistic about the human species. We have terrifying toys now for terrifying weapons, and we still have, I think, largely Pleistocene brains. And recent events show that people are prepared to take astonishing risks. So, in a sense, I think what I'm saying is nothing beyond what we all know from history. I think the one sort of slight point of optimism that one can look for is the notion that proactive aggression, which is the key form of aggression, is subject to our judgments of its predictive value, or its value, or we're trying to predict it. In other words, if we can construct a world in which it's not going to pay to conduct proactive aggression, it's not going to happen. So this is at least a different model from one that might have said, well, humans just have this tendency to be aggressive regardless and fight regardless. I think that we can say that we have got a lot of common sense. The only problem is, can we actually predict in a complicated world well enough to be able to inhibit our tendencies for proactive aggression? And that's obviously a very open question, and it kind of leads us back in the direction of the security dilemma, because each side would want to be able to get to the point where it can defend itself so well that the other side will not be tempted to attack, and we all know that problem. So no, I don't feel particularly optimistic. I welcome people who are more optimistic than I am, but I do think that we have been a species in which the males have behaved extremely unpleasantly for thousands of generations, and we'll be lucky to be able to control us well. Steve Pinker saw the trends of reduced aggression and said there are reasonable chance that they're going to carry on, going down. I hope he's right. There was one between. Okay. So can we go straight to matriarchy? So you asked about matriarchy, which, it happens in a bunch of animals. It can involve extremely aggressive females, like in spotted hyenas, where they commit infanticide and commit lethal intergroup aggression and so on. It doesn't necessarily have to. Bonobos are somewhat matriarchal. I mean, there's kind of a balanced relationship between males and females there. And the females are certainly capable of being very aggressive in coalition against males who threaten a baby, for instance. So there's no automatic association of matriarchy with reduced aggression compared to males. Within humans, I think that the discussion of matriarchy is a little bit complicated. It's very clear that there are some societies in which women can form really important all-female groups, like in parts of Nigeria and Cameroon, that can dominate trade. So in other words, that from the point of view of the economy in the relatively small-scale societies that they traditionally lived in, you might say it was matriarchal. But I don't think there is any society on earth in which the decisions about control of violence are taken by groups of women and not by groups of men. I think that if you look at the law, which is, really, I think, an absolutely critical feature, because, I mean, it's critical in all sorts of ways. I think the way you define a group is you define it as the group that has a single law. And if you look at what happens at the decision-making process, it is ultimately dominated by groups of men. So that although there are maybe matriarchies from the point of view of, there may be female kings, as they're sometimes called, or queens, as we might know them. But ultimately, the control of violence lies with men. And to that extent, I think that patriarchy is a universal feature of the human species, as, by the way, is gerontocracy. Gerontocracy is extreme in the United States right now. But it's never the young males. It's never the sort of 20 to 30-year-olds who are in charge of societies. It's always the ones who are older than that. And you were up.
I think with self-domestication, briefly.
Oh, self-domestication to patriarchy.
Yes.
Well, I mean, in a sense, I think I gave the argument just now, which is that it all starts with the control of the despot male by a group of other males. And once they have done that, once they have succeeded in controlling the male who was bullying them, as an alpha male chimpanzee bullies the other males, or an alpha male gorilla bullies the other males, or an alpha male, any other animal bullies those males. Once you've got the human ability to overcome that and have the group of males now dominate anyone who tries to be a bully, once you've got that, they have discovered something extraordinary. And that extraordinary thing is they are in charge and they're not being bullied by another male. They can control all the males in the group. They can control the single individual best fighter in the group. That means they can control anybody in the group. And guess who that includes? That includes females. So in this view, the emergence of a group of males who are there because they can control the bully male, they have discovered something incidentally, which is they can control the females as well. And it's like in animals, where among male animals, in some species, it really pays males to be very big, because that's a great way to fight. If size matters when you're fighting, larger size, then males become much bigger than females. Well, guess what the incidental result of that is? Those males can dominate those females. In other species, it doesn't pay males to fight by being big. They might be fighting by being more agile, having better weapons of a different type. But when males benefit from male-male competition by achieving power, however incidentally, they will tend to use it against females. So that's my totally depressing argument. And, I mean, there was the question about optimism. At least you can say this, we're an incredible species from the point of view of how we have escaped from some of the worst of this stuff. We do have this extraordinary tolerance, and now thanks to new norms, new tweaks of our institutions, we have a system in which we believe in human rights. I mean, talk to a chimpanzee about that, they would laugh in your face.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Richard.
Okay.